This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Benchmade Mini Griptilian. Another classic review. I'm going to flip it this way just so it sits better on the table. Another classic review of a classic Benchmade. Just reviewed the full-size Griptilian. Let's see how the mini version holds up. Spoiler alert, I do like this version a little bit better, just like I did with the RSK. And I think a lot of the design philosophy of the Griptilian shines the best in the smaller version. So I try to go through reviews in 3 sections. First we do some specifications, size comparisons, things like that. Then we look at the knife tip to tail. And finally we review it on a 10-point scale. Let's get into it. So starting with our specifications here. Oops, I forgot the little name up there. This is the Benchmade Mini Griptilian. USA made, retailed for $165 back when it was discontinued. This is the 20CV and G10 version. There were versions, the FRN versions you can get for something in the realm of $135, $150, something like that today. But Benchmade has publicly discontinued the Griptilian, so what you see at retailers is really what's sort of left over from old stock. 2.91 inches of blade on the Mini. 110 thousandths on the blade stock. That is a tenth or a hundredth of an inch thinner than the full-sized Griptilian. 20 CV on this version here. 6.78 inches overall. 2.9 ounces, so slightly less than an ounce an inch, where the full size was a bit more than an ounce an inch. And like most Axis locks, this runs on phosphor bronze washers. Now, this is a much, much smaller knife than your full-size Griptilian. I mean, this is a very mini Griptilian. Smaller blade, smaller handle, way, way smaller overall profile, and smaller in the pocket. If we compare this to another small knife I quite like, the Spyderco Native, here with some AWT scales, you can see the Griptilian is a small knife. This is smaller than even something like the Native. If we compare it to the Delica, you can see the Mini Griptilian is a small knife. It is frankly even a little bit smaller than your Delica. It makes the Delica look kind of large. Here it is compared to your small Sebenza. And you can see it is about the same size as your small Sebenza, which is a small knife. It does not like to sit nicely on the table. If we compare it to our Bug Out, quite a bit smaller than the Bug Out. And if we compare it to your TRM Neutron, you can see lengthwise a little bit smaller in both the blade and the handle than the Neutron. Stock is a little bit thicker than the Neutron. Handle is a little bit thicker than the Neutron. But overall, the Griptilian in my full-size Griptilian review, I mentioned how that felt like a very large knife. This is a legitimately small knife. But it is very much a mini Griptilian. You've got the exact same features here, starting with the blade. You've got this modified drop point here, where this is a little bit more conventional. Again, your tip's still a little bit higher than your pivot, so it's a relatively high tip drop point with a relatively low saber grind. You've got your full thickness running out to about here, so you're keeping that 110,000 stock for most of the blade thickness. If you look at that tip, it's a pretty robust tip. With it being high and also robust, very nice, very natural for stabbing, piercing, as well as your cuts that get down on the table and sort of drag. This one here, you do still have a little bit of that continuous belly that you have in the full-size Griptilian, but it does even out a bit more to a flat in this mini Griptilian here. But this is, all the benefits of a typical drop point. It's a very versatile blade shape while being designed for being relatively robust. Benchmade chose, rather than doing something like a full flat grind, to basically do a saber grind and again to carry that stock thickness pretty far out. This is a knife that is meant to be much like the 940 or the 945 in this case, versatile more than super slicey. If they had ground this taller, they could have made this a more slicey blade. Instead, they chose to keep it thicker, keep it a little bit more robust at the edge. It is still slicey. It's not meant to be a super slicer. It's not going to be quite as slicey as something like your TRM Atom, just from the function that the TRM Atom has thinner stock to begin with and so much more space to drop. This will be thinner right at the edge, and this can be made to be slicier with a good grind, but frankly, with 110 thousandths blade stock, even with that sort of more moderate saber grind, this mini Griptilian blade gets sharp enough for most cutting tasks you would need for a small 3-inch knife like this. Not going to be your super slicer for peeling grapes, not going to be super great for, popping hairs and things like that. But especially if you aggressively lay this edge back and sharpen it pretty aggressively, you can get some very solid slicing performance, as good as you need without it being impressive out of this blade, because again, it's designed to be a relatively tough little sub 3-inch blade. Action. Very nice as is typical for Benchmade. With an axis lock, you do get that free dropping, snappy axis lock action. This one's a little gummy right now, but I just sort of would have to tune the pivot a little bit to work it out. Benchmade's thumb studs are very nice to actuate. It's really just bar stock with some concentric circles and a Torx bit on top, but it grips your finger very nicely. It's very naturally positioned, very easy to pop that up and drop it down. And then your axis lock here, again, same sort of thing, very easy to grip, very nice and grippy. You can either flick it out like that, or if you want to drop it, you just sort of pull back, give it a shake, and it will drop. The nice thing about these G10 handles, because this was the special edition version with G10 handles and a 20 CV blade, is there is right now no play in this one, and in general there were less play in these Griptilians, which also have a slightly larger pivot, less play in these Griptilians than in most Griptilians at the time, which a lot of the FRM ones had some really bad blade play, but also just less blade play than Benchmade in general around the time that this came out, while still getting that nice free droppy action. This will, the play will come and go depending on how you tighten the pivot, things like that. Benchmades are very, very pivot sensitive, but the axis lock feels a little bit more robust than most Benchmades of this time did, noting that this knife is a couple years old at this point. Again, I'll lay it down this way. Clip side up, just so that clip basically makes it so it doesn't sit nicely on the table. Which basically means the axis lock feels about as good as a modern Benchmade, frankly. Benchmade has managed to get most of that play out of their pivots these days. Going back to the handle, it is a mini version of the full-size Griptilian handle. You have this very nice, fully contoured G10 handle, gray G10 on top with a blue G10 underlay. It's a very nice little detail, and it's cool to see that pop of color and those blue standoffs right there every time you sort of look down the profile, or even as you're using it and you just see that. It's a nice little bit of visual interest that they didn't have to do. You've got jimping here as well as jimping on the spine of the blade. Not very functional jimping. It's really ornamental or for indexing, so that your fingers know where they are without looking. Even as you press down, it's not really doing that much. Same thing, there's some jimping down here. It's mostly just to make your finger feel a little bit more secure in that little finger index here. Now, this is, it's still got that sort of bulbous profile in that not just it goes thin and then goes wide here and then thin toward the tip, but you see the same thing across the contour where it gets thin and then it gets fattest right here. It has a big belly and then it gets thin again toward the back. It's less extreme on the mini than it was on the full size. Similarly, you do have this nice front swoop here, which gives you a nice front index or a nice index for your front finger and your thumb. This pinch right here, front finger and thumb, feels nice and secure. And then the rest of this sort of belly here rolls more into sort of the top of your palm and your knuckles, because this just is a relatively small knife. Now, the ergonomic expectations on a small knife like this are lesser than on a large knife. You're not expecting a really aggressively contoured handle on a 3-inch knife. In fact, if you do something like the XM18 3-inch, where you do have those crazy contoured lines, those big choils and cutouts and things like that, it can sometimes be awkward for people whose hands aren't the perfect size. One good example of that is some people find the small Chris Reeve and Cosi terrible ergonomically, whereas some people find it fantastic, and that really depends on your hand size and how big your fingers are or things like that. This is a still relatively neutral handle. Your major lines are this big fat belly here, which again rolls into your palm, and this pinch point here, which gives you control over the knife. That with this sort of overall contoured fat shape, it feels nice, and it does feel much like the big one, comfortable in the hand. It is comfortable to hold. It kind of feels like, a kind of fat broomstick or just some other rounded object. It's nice and unobtrusive to hold in the hand. Now, much like my complaint with the large size, this is very neutral back here. There is nothing really keeping these back 3 fingers from crushing into each other, pulling apart, or even really keeping them on this handle. As you start to push this knife harder, if you say, often when I'm in the garden, if I hit a stiff branch or a particularly stiff stem or something like that, or if I'm going through cardboard and I hit, one of those sections that has the glue on it and stuff like that, and it just gets a little harder, you will feel that you need to grip this knife very hard, because it is not going to feel like you have a ton of control over the blade. The handle is not locking your hand in any meaningful way, shape, or form. That can lead to hand fatigue. This is a handle that you have to grip. It will not grip you back. It's comfortable. It's nicely rounded everywhere. You're not going to feel any hot spots or discomfort when you do that, but you're also not going to feel locked in. That is more forgivable in this 3-inch package than it necessarily was in the full-size package, because this is a much smaller knife, and frankly, again, the ergonomic expectations for a 3-inch knife are much lower. And that's both because of the realities of it being a small knife, and also the fact that you're just not using a 3-inch knife for stuff that is as heavy duty, as robust, as demanding. And it's just a simple consequence of that. So my gripes about the full-size Griptilian, which largely were that, my ergonomic gripes, which largely were that this handle, other than this point up here, I really like the way that this front part is designed. It looks nice, and it also, gives you that great pinch point there. This butt feels comfortable but not secure, and so I don't love the way it actually feels in use. All of those complaints are still present, but they're a lot less important in this smaller package. Instead, what you get all the benefits of a neutral handle, which is it works very well in this grip. You can climb up and pinch the blade. This grip here, where you sort of rest it against your palm, get 3 fingers down there, use this finger index here for your middle finger. This grip is really nice and secure. You can do lots of really good work on the blade like this, and it shows off the versatility of this blade. This is a handle that is very easy to have in your pocket, sort of flip it out, grip it whatever way you need to, very naturally, without really thinking about how you grip it, and it's always going to feel fine. It is going to feel limited when you start to push it harder, but 3-inch knives that continue to feel good as you push them harder are limited, and those are exceptional. This isn't bad compared to its realistic competition. And other than that, as we look around it, you've got the same very nicely done G10 pattern. Again, it's a very big contour. You get that nice sort of wood swirly look when you contour G10 like that. You've got the diamond pattern carried over from the FRN. It's obviously more subtle here, kind of fades in and out of the G10 very nicely. Honestly, it's more ornamental. There's a little bit of texture here, but it's not giving you that much grip. You've got your back here, open design again with those standoffs. This jimping isn't doing anything here. Again, just ornamental and indexing. Same stuff on the other side, typical Benchmade clip, typical Benchmade hardware, all of which is fine. It's functional, but not pretty. And I sort of already talked about the axis lock. So that's kind of the tip-to-tail overview of your mini Griptilian. Honestly, other than sort of the ergonomics and the general features of the blade, there's not that much to talk about. It's a pretty basic knife. So with that said, we can just get to our scores a little bit more quickly than we typically do. I'm going to keep it this way so that it sits nicely on the table. Again, 10 scores here, 5 related to sort of your knife enthusiast fun factor, and 5 related to the functionality of it. Let's start with the blade design over on the fun factor side. I'm going to give this blade design a B+. I gave the full size a B. I really like the utility of this particular drop point on a blade of this size. And actually, I like this particular Benchmade Griptilian drop point shape more than the full flat ground sort of drop point that we get on the mini RSK. This drop point is a really nice and versatile blade shape. It does keep a robust amount of blade stock relatively far out toward the tip. So even for a small knife, you can feel like you can use this pretty hard. You can drag that tip, you can stab that tip, you can scrape with it, do all the sorts of stuff that you would start to feel a little skeevy if you started doing them with the, something like your TRM Neutron that gets super, super thin. You can push a mini Griptilian blade pretty hard. And you can use it for hard usey kind of stuff. It kind of feels like a 940 or a 945 in that regard. This tip is very easy to puncture with, very natural to use. The nice gentle curve you get along the whole blade is just very easy and natural to use. It's not exceptional at anything, but it works well at a lot of things. And the fact is, even though it's not a slicing champ, starting with 110 thousandths blade stock, even with this grind here, it's a decently aggressive flat grind. Given how slicey it does get, it's not going to be a king slicer, but it will be slicey enough for what you need. And I think the overall design philosophy of this blade, which was to be slicey enough and favor robustness, is a very smart thing to do and works really well in making for a versatile 3-inch or sub 3-inch knife. It also, it's not an interesting blade design, but again, given how sub 3-inch knives can often be a little boring, this exact same blade design, first off, I think it works a little nicer in this smaller size with everything cramped together a little bit. The features like having, this smaller saber grind, having the logo a little bigger, having the all of the features just closer together, it makes the blade look a little nicer. The swedge takes up a little bit more of the blade. But overall, it's not an interesting design, but it's interesting to use and it works very nicely. So honestly, I think that this is a very good blade for a knife of this size. Handle design, over on this side. I'm going to give, again, a slightly higher score than I give the full-size Griptilian. I'm going to give it a B. A lot of that is sort of, this design is a bit of a classic, but frankly, this is a very comfortable, very nice and easy to grip handle that doesn't have anything remarkable about it from a design perspective. It's very simple. It's, a big front, a pinch, and then a big fat belly. That's a very simple sort of design, but it is so easy to just grip and go and do whatever you'd like with it. It's so easy to just pull out of your pocket and just naturally grip and just get your task done, that it's super, super functional. And it's as ergonomic as a knife in this range really needs to be. And frankly, because it's not as big, it's not as heavy, it's not as fat, and because of the way the handle not being as fat also means that the balance is a bit more blade heavy in this smaller version, or I should say it doesn't feel quite as handle heavy. The exact same handle design works a little bit better on this smaller profile than it does on the full size profile. I'm going to give it a B. Action is also a B here. It is a fine axis lock action. It's not super satisfying just because this is a relatively light blade, and so it ends up being a bit more of a shake shut than a drop shut. You need to give it a little bit of momentum to get started. But still, the placement of that thumb stud is very nice and natural. They're great thumb studs, just enough resistance to give a satisfying pop. It does snap out very nicely. And again, these G10 Griptilians in particular seem to have relatively little play compared to most Benchmades of this period. So I'm going to give it a B there. Fit and finish is still going to be a B-, honestly. This is a pretty simple design. The hardware still does feel a little cheap. The pivot is nice, but it's just the Parkerized steel hardware, especially as it wears in, starts to look a little beat up, not necessarily a good way. The blade grinds are functional but simple. Blade play will come and go with this one. It's good by the standards of Benchmade from a few years ago. Those aren't very good standards to be compared to. And again, even though everything is relatively tight, the contouring is relatively nice. It's still not exactly razor tight anywhere if you look at like the gaps between the axis lock and the G10, or you look at just how the how nicely the standoffs are machined, and you look at it's not a complex knife anywhere, and it's fine throughout. There's nothing impressive about the fit and finish here. That might have been different back when this 20CV version originally came out, which was many years ago. It might have been more impressive back then, but the fact is, this exact same configuration, if this knife came out by somebody other than Benchmade, with the level of fit and finish and the level of sort of spit and polish in this, you would be expecting something in like probably upper tier Civivi to, it feels like the same sort of level as something like a Wii Banter, which is like the very bottom of Wii or something like that. Like frankly, it's not even quite that tight or snappy. It's fine, but it does just feel not quite as nice as most modern knives. And the cool factor, I'm giving a B. I'm going all the way up to a B here because honestly, especially if you look around sort of the knife internet online, even more than the full-size Griptilian, the mini Griptilian is a very formative knife for a lot of people. Most people that have been in the knife community for a long time have probably owned and probably even really enjoyed a mini Griptilian for some period. This is a knife that got a lot of people into knives. It was Benchmade's sort of signature knife for a very long time until the bug out kind of took that mantle. I guess this and the 940 are sort of like pre-bug out Benchmade. They're really what Benchmade was known for. The design also overall just works a lot nicer. It feels more sleek and streamlined and just balanced in this smaller package than it does in the big version. It doesn't feel big and bulbous and fat. It feels just like a knife that is meant to be easy to carry, meant to be easy to hold, and is really prioritized for that grip experience. It's right in the name, and not optimized for looks, but it also doesn't look bad. And it's got little things like that pop of color. It's got a relatively attractive blade, albeit a basic one. Cool factor, it's a B. It's not cool, but it's also not uncool. It's not dorky. And honestly, I think the mini Griptilian looks a little cooler than the mini RSK as well. Partially because of how this drop point blade balances with that handle. The bigger sort of more almost sheep's footy looking blade on the RSK one just doesn't balance with the handle quite as well aesthetically. So overall, the fun factor on this knife is a B. It's not fun. It's not cool, but it's also not like, ugh, it doesn't feel quite as behind the curve. It feels expensive for what it is, but it doesn't feel as behind the curve from a design perspective. Again, a lot of that's because it's sort of grading against the curve in the sense that it's comparing itself to other 3-inch knives where the standards for fun just aren't quite as high. Function. Cutting performance is a B. Again, 110,000 stock with a relatively low saber grind. It cuts as well as it needs to. It's not slicey, but it's also not slicey. And there were never any tasks where I was using this and I felt like it was letting me down or I wished for it to be able to cut better. This is totally at the sort of forward end of as slicey as you need, where it's never impressively slicey, though I'm sure you could lay this edge back aggressively and get some very good slicing performance out of it. But it is not even just as slicey as you need. It is frankly even a little bit better than you need, where it does cut well, as long as you do have a decent edge on it. Some of Benchmade's factory edges back at this point were not so great. But it will cut as well as you need, frankly even a little bit better than you need, but only a little bit better than you need. Cutting performance is fine. Where it gets the B+ is utility, because this blade shape is very much in the same realm as the 940 in that, and frankly, this honestly feels like it should almost be an A-. This is a really nice, versatile sub 3-inch blade shape. It's tough. it's pointy, it's got enough belly to do everything that you want, and the handle is neutral enough that you can always access that blade. It becomes very intuitive to use. You don't have to think about where the blade is all that hard. This just becomes a very nice, easy, simple knife to carry that, to the extent that any sub 3-inch knife can be your everyday carry, which really depends on your use tasks. There are some people that just have larger knife needs that know that they're never going to be able to only carry a sub 3-inch knife. If you're cutting through stuff that is more than 3 inches thick, frankly, more than like 2.5 inches thick, a 3-inch knife is going to be frustrating to use. If you're using very big tasks that require those sorts of more aggressive ergonomic lines, a 3-inch knife is going to be difficult to use. But for all those people, which I think are most people, that can actually get away with a sub 3-inch knife, this overall blade and handle package is quite versatile, consistently pleasant to use, and honestly, it feels like, again, a B+ bordering on an A- on that utility, and a lot of it does come down to how thoughtfully this drop point is designed for that intended highly versatile use case. Feel is still a B- in the sense that, well, I'm going to make it a B. I'm going to make it a B because it is neutral. The downside of that neutrality is the second that you start to push this harder, the second that you start to feel resistance in that cut, you're going to feel yourself having to grab harder and harder and harder, and you're going to get that hand strain from having to hold onto this knife actively, especially toward the butt here. This butt, and I don't have big hands, feels like it wants to sort of slip out, and it feels like my hand kind of wants to slip off the back of this knife a little bit. So as it gets pushed harder, I don't love the ergonomics of it, but again, it's a 3-inch knife. And 95% of the time with this knife, you're going to be just gripping it and just grabbing it like this and using it for something pretty light, or pinching it up like this and using it to, cut a zip tie, cut a little bit of twine, cut open a package, cut some tape, whatever. And honestly, it's a very comfortable, nicely rounded handle that rolls neatly and nicely into your hand and works in just about every grip you can throw at it. Again, ergonomic demands for a 3-inch knife are just lesser than they are for larger knives, but given that bill, this is decently ergonomic. There's nothing great about it. It's never a time where this felt like it was melting into my hand. There was never a time that it felt like it was sublime, and there was never a time that I was impressed at any level with how easy it was to hold, how good it was to use, any of that. But it is fine across the board, and frankly, fine across the board is nice to have. It's never an issue. Carry? Actually, no. Carry's going to be a B as well. This handle being so much less chunky than the full-size Griptilian makes this actually a relatively nice and small knife to carry. This thing is just barely under 1 ounce an inch. And if you compare this again to other small knives, this is a legitimately small knife. This thing does disappear in your pocket relatively well, and frankly, it does get a little chunky at the midsection there, so it feels a bit bigger in the pocket than maybe something like the Delica does, just because the Delica is so slim. But because of this smooth G10, stuff can also slide past it in the pocket very nicely. When this is hanging in your pocket, you can have other stuff in there sliding around and by it, and this won't sort of snag on stuff. This won't scratch up other stuff, things like that. It's still not a lightweight knife relative to the size it is. There are lots of lighter knives of this size. There are lots of slimmer knives of this size. Again, if I pull out my Sebenza here, if you look at the thickness, you can see even at its thinnest point, it's a little thinner than the Sebenza. And if you look at the overall profile, it is just a bigger profile in your pocket, especially in this dimension, than something like the Sebenza. It's lighter than the Sebenza, but honestly, I will take a little bit more weight for a smaller profile over something that is lighter but a little chunkier. So the carry isn't great. It's not remarkably good. It's good in general because the 3-inch knife and small knives are just easier to carry. But unlike the big boy, the full-size Griptilian, which was a pain to carry, this one is fine, about what you would expect for a knife of its size, so it's a B. And then value, $165 for this. Honestly, this particular one I have on my table would probably be a B because I have not gotten any play in this one. But I know that most of these axis locks are still going to have a little bit of play. You're still going to have little fit and finish issues, things like that. $165, which was the last price these sold for. Honestly, they'd probably be like $185, $190 if they sold today. It just feels a little high for what is mostly G10 with steel hardware, steel on the insides, and a very simple design. This milling pattern, the milling on this handle definitely took a lot of machine time. Like, I'm not taking anything away from that, albeit G10 machine's a lot faster than titanium. But it does feel like, put it this way, if a brand other than Benchmade put out an identical knife, it probably would be like 140. People would expect it to be like 135, 140, not 165. And again, if Benchmade put this knife out today, it would be more than 165 for sure. So it feels a little bit behind the curve on value, but frankly, that's Benchmade. And so function overall is a B, and so this is a B knife. And this is a knife that is fine. And with the full size, my conclusion was sort of, it's a bit of a hard knife to recommend because there are so many other good options out there. This one here is just a good option. I don't think I like it overall quite as much as the Mini RSK. I don't have my Mini RSK anymore. I did sell that one because I just wasn't carrying it. But I do think the Mini RSK, especially at the prices they're charging for it, is probably a slightly better knife overall. In particular, the grippy texture that you get here on the RSK is significantly better, adds to the grip. The overall differences in the handle design just make it a little bit nicer. And then the fit and finish on that Mini RSK is a significant step up from what you get in the Griptilian. And frankly, it's immaterial because this knife isn't being made anymore anyway. But where the old Griptilian felt behind the curve, this one still feels like a pretty solid choice. It still feels like a very versatile, very easy to carry, and just solid sub 3-inch knife, nearly 3-inch knife. It is the sort of knife that you could give to most knife people or most non-knife people, and they would be like, yeah, that's a pretty good knife. There's nothing impressive about it. There's a lot of little design details that you can see are relatively well thought out. But there's nothing that's going to blow you away. There's nothing about its looks that'll blow you away. There's nothing about its performance that'll blow you away. But you will consistently, using a Mini Griptilian, be like, yeah, that did the job. And it did it pretty well. And it was easy to carry. And it was easy to cut with. And it's a nice blade shape. And it seems to do everything I want pretty well. And honestly, that's a great thing for a knife of this size to have that set of characteristics. This is really sort of like almost the epitome of like a fine knife. It's good. It's decent. It's even better than decent. I would say it's good. And a lot of people have really liked the Mini Griptilian for many years for that reason. I would actually be curious, now that this is discontinued, people have talked about the Redoubt as sort of the spiritual successor to the Griptilian, which I kind of see. If you think about the Griptilian as more like a workhorse knife, then I can see that. I feel like it's a little bit different. It's made a little heavier duty than the Griptilian. But I would be really curious to see, now that this is discontinued or all but, I would love to see Benchmade sort of look at refreshing the Mini Griptilian platform a little bit. Keep the majority of the blade shape, maybe slim down the handle a little bit, maybe tweak the ergonomics a little bit, because this is still a very good knife. And frankly, it's also a nice alternative to something like your bug out. If you compare it to the bug out, it's a little bit smaller. It's a little bit chunkier ergonomically, which for some people is a plus. It carries heavier, it carries bigger, but it's also got a blade design that is significantly tougher and more robust than the bug out without actually sacrificing that much cutting performance. So honestly, I think for a lot of people, the Mini Grip would probably be a better knife than the Mini bug out, or than the full-size bug out, while doing pretty much the same things. But that's not an option that most of us have anymore. The fact is, the best option right now to get the Mini Griptilian is the Mini RSK, which I think I said at the time was my most recommended sub 3-inch knife. And all that DNA is here as well, and it's just a very compelling, very good overall package. In every way that there's a difference between this and the Mini RSK version, the Mini RSK is arguably superior, except for this blade shape. If you could take this drop point blade shape and put it onto the Mini RSK, I would still have that knife. I would still love that knife. As it is right now, this is the one thing that the Griptilian's got, and it is a great blade shape for a sub 3-inch knife. But anyway, I'm rambling a bit now. It's a solid knife. And that's really the end of it. And if you see one on the secondary and you're curious, give it a shot. Lots and lots of people have loved the Mini Griptilian for lots and lots of years. So there you go. This has been Clark the Knife, and this has been my review of the Benchmade Mini Griptilian. Hope you found that useful or at least entertaining as we sit here at 35 minutes. If you did find this helpful or entertaining, please give me a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and drop a comment down below about your thoughts, your experience with the Mini Griptilian. I would love to hear about it, and it'll sort of help this channel grow. And let me know if there are any other knives you'd like me to look at. And other than that, hope this was a good use of your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye now.